In this video, we're going to cover Nintendo DS emulation on the Xbox Series X and S version of Retroarch. The Xbox Series X and S version of Retroarch has two Nintendo DS cores, Melon DS and DeSmuMe. Over the years, Melon DS has definitely been the preferable one, but DeSmuMe still offers a number of features that shouldn't be overlooked. While Nintendo DS isn't one of my favorite handheld systems, it does have an amazing library of titles, and it is great to be able to play them on the Xbox, even though touchscreen support can be a bit unwieldy with the controller. But in this video, we're going to go ahead and cover both those cores so you can get the best possible DS emulation experience. So let's go ahead and dive in. Now, as always, this guide is a continuation of my Retroarch install guide and dev mode setup guide, so if you haven't gotten dev mode set up or Retroarch installed, follow along with this video to do so before continuing on, and do make sure that you have a properly formatted USB drive before trying to dive into emulation. All covered in this video, so go here first. But to get up and running with Nintendo DS emulation, all you really need are Nintendo DS games. Both Melon DS and DeSmuMe support a high-level implemented Nintendo DS BIOS file now, so you don't actually need them to play a majority of games. Now, that being said, there are still some games that require them for best possible performance, and if you want to access the DS menus to change settings, they are also going to be needed. So down in the description, I will have links to how to dump Nintendo DS firmware as well as DS games if you happen to have a huge physical collection and still have physical systems. Otherwise, you can resort to the Googles to find this stuff, but as always, illegal download links are not provided on this channel, so don't ask. Once you have your Nintendo DS games sourced, they should be in an extension of .nds, but if you would like to zip them to save space, that is perfectly acceptable to both of the Nintendo DS cores within Retroarch. And as far as the BIOS files go, you need one named BIOS7.bin, BIOS9.bin, and then firmware.bin. But go ahead and get your Xbox Retroarch USB drive hooked up to your computer, and you can add your Nintendo DS games into your games folder, while the BIOS files will go into your Retroarch folder, system, and then just straight on in, like so. And with all of that placed, go ahead and unhook the USB drive from your computer and plug it into your Xbox, get booted up into dev mode and into Retroarch. Once Retroarch has booted up, you need to go down to the online updater, core downloader, press right on your D-pad to go down to Nintendo and find DeSmuMe and Melon DS. You can use one or the other, or both. So just press A on the ones you want to download. If you plan on only using one core, Melon DS is definitely my preferred, but again, there are benefits to having both. Once those cores are downloaded, you can go ahead and back out to the main menu, and you are now free to begin loading up your Nintendo DS content. So one method of doing so is to go up to Load Content, navigate to your E drive, find your games folder, find your Nintendo DS games within it, select a game, select a core, and it will run. Now, personally, I'm not a big fan of that method. It's long-winded, so I like to make a games playlist instead. So you can do this by going down to Import Content, Scan Directory, navigate to your Nintendo DS games folder, tell it to scan this directory, and then just let it do its thing. And if everything goes as it should, you should see a new Nintendo DS playlist entry here on the left, but the Import Content button doesn't always like zipped stuff, so you might have to do a manual scan if your games are zipped up. So just go to Manual Scan, Content Directory, navigate to your Nintendo DS games folder, scan this directory, system name, press right on your D-pad to go down to Nintendo, find Nintendo DS. You can choose your default core here between DeSmuMe or Melon DS if you want, or leave it on unspecified if you want to choose the core at launch. Make sure Scan Recursively is set to on if you have any games in subfolders, and then make sure Scan Inside Archives is on if you have them zipped up like I do. And then you can start the scan. And now over on the left, we have our Nintendo DS playlist with our games inside. So we're going to start off today's example with Melon DS. So just choose any game in your playlist, tell it to run, and then choose Melon DS. Alright, so here we are playing Nintendo DS games on the Xbox Series S through the Melon DS core. Alright, so Melon DS is again a very capable Nintendo DS emulator. It's got a big focus on accuracy over the last few years, and again, it's just become my go-to way of playing Nintendo DS games. Well, with that being said, let's go ahead and talk about some of the core options available within Melon DS. So going into our Retroarch quick menu, scroll down to core options. And our first set of options are in System, so this is to set your console mode. It is set to DS by default, but you can also set it to DSi if you happen to have DSi firmware installed in your Retroarch system folder. DSi mode does still require DSi firmware, which I'm not covering in this video. Next, we have boot game directly, and this is turned on by default. If you have the BIOS and firmware files in your system folder, you can turn this off to experience your DS emulation like on original hardware if you opted to boot into the DS menu. Our next option is another BIOS one, so if you place the firmware file from your actual DS, you can turn this option on to use it in your emulation. Next, language selection, so you can change your language manually in here if you would like, otherwise it's set by your firmware file if you placed one. Next, you can randomize your MAC address and enable a DSi SD card. Again, DSi stuff isn't going to be really covered in this video. But next up, Video tab. First up is Threaded Software Renderer, and I really recommend turning this option on. And the reason for this is to improve performance in Nintendo DS emulation. DS emulation is very CPU heavy, so being able to use more CPU threads on it is a plus. You might notice some slight added input latency, but the performance trade-off makes it more than worth it in most cases. And the last option in this tab is for the OpenGL renderer, and unfortunately the Xbox Series X and S don't natively support OpenGL backends and rely on angle cores, which this is not. So OpenGL rendering is not possible on the Xbox Series X and S, and I'll give you a quick demo of what happens if you try it. So here we go. You see that I've been playing Metal Slug 7 here just fine. We're going to enable the OpenGL rendering, close the content. Now we'll tell it to run again. And yeah, there you go. Big fat nothing. Surprised it hasn't crashed to the dev mode home screen yet. But anyway, I'm gonna go delete my config file and we will pick back up in a moment. But alright, here we go. Anyway, I got my settings all set back up to where they were before, minus the OpenGL renderer, and as you can see here, we have our Nintendo DS main menu here. Anyways, back into our settings. So again, do not turn on the OpenGL renderer. It doesn't work on Xbox because this is not an angle version of the core. That may change in the future, but as of now, no. Alright, next up, audio emulation. So microphone input, this is set to blow noise. You could also choose just white noise, which will just give you a more consistent pattern, I guess. But to use the microphone input in games that require it, you are going to need to visit your controls tab, port 1 controls, and you're going to need to make sure that you have one of your buttons assigned to make microphone noise. By default, that is the left trigger. You could change this to whatever you want, so just be aware that that is a thing. Next up, audio bitrate. This is set to automatic, so you could change it to 10 or 16 bit, depending on the quality you want. 16 will be better, but you're also fine just to leave it on auto. And then audio interpolation, give it a different type of a filter to change the output sound. It's going to be personal preference if you like any of this. I personally do not. Next up, screen. So first option here, touch mode, and this is the reason why I left us on the main menu of the DS screen here. It is set to mouse by default. We need to change it over to joystick to be able to move our cursor. And then you click in on the right thumbstick to activate the touchscreen. And now you can use it like a touchscreen on a Nintendo DS and scroll through different things that are available within the bottom screen here. So again, not as friendly as you would hope, but it does work. Next, we have a swap screen mode. So this is actually pretty useful depending on the screen layout you have. So these two really tie in together. So for example, on Metal Slug 7 here, we can make it so only our top screen shows. So just a quick look at that. This is what it looks like if you only have the top screen of your Nintendo DS emulation showing up. But if for whatever reason you need to be able to see your bottom screen at any time, you could just pull press your right trigger, and depending on that other option, it'll either swap to your bottom screen or it'll be a quick swap. So you have to hold it down, and as soon as you let go of the trigger, the top screen will reappear. So very cool feature, especially for games that don't really utilize one of the screens as well as other titles. So for this one, I typically prefer to use hold just because I don't need to swap them too often. But there's a lot more screen layouts available than just top or bottom only. As you saw, there's just your standard top bottom, which is your traditional DS look. You can flip that to being bottom on top and top on bottom. You can place them side by side to make them bigger. And then you can swap their positions here as well. And then of course, again, top only, bottom only. But the ones that I really enjoy are these hybrid top and hybrid bottom ones. So with these ones set, you get a bigger top screen and a regular size bottom screen, and they fit better within a 16:9 monitor screen, and you retain all functionality, and you can still get all the information present on that bottom screen. And then of course you can show the bottom screen bigger at any point if desired, using that right trigger. But you can also make it so the bottom screen is the big one. But with the hybrid option selected, a new option will actually appear in here called hybrid small screen mode. So with this option, you can show either just the bottom screen, the top screen, or have both screens show up on the sides. So that way you just get this nice representation of it right here, so you can still see what it looks like in its smaller size while also displaying it bigger. It's pretty cool. Unfortunately, the hybrid ratio option that shows up here is only available on OpenGL backend renderer, so we don't get access to that on Xbox. But anyway, if you're using just a typical top-bottom screen layout, you can also change the screen gap between your screens, and I believe that 90 pixels is the proper ratio for original Nintendo DS screens, but you can set it to whatever the heck you like. Personal preference. Alright, backing out, CPU emulation. So honestly, you're not going to really mess with anything in here. The only one you might really change around is the JIT block size to lower it in certain titles to get better results, but for the most part, it's fine at 32 and you won't need to change it. You can go to the Melon DS forums and see if people have mentioned smaller JIT block sizes in certain titles that you're trying to play. Otherwise, just leave it alone. And the same goes for the rest of these options as well. And with that, we've covered all of the core options within Melon DS. So as always, if there's some settings you want to have set for some games but not others, head up to Manage Core Options and save them as a game options file so that way they only apply to that single game and not the core as a whole. Alright, so now we're going to cover DeSmuMe. So we're just going to load up Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow for this example. So we'll choose DeSmuMe for this one. Alright, so here we are within Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow. So I chose this game specifically so we can just get the touchscreen controls out of the way first. So by default, you will not be able to use the touchscreen with DeSmuMe, just like on Melon DS. So to remedy this, just go into your Retroarch quick menu, Core Options, navigate down to the Input tab, scroll down until you see Pointer Mode for left analog or Pointer Mode for right analog. Now, depending on which one you want to use, just press A and change it to emulated or absolute. So absolute will always return the pointer to center, which can be useful for games like Metroid Prime Hunters, whereas emulated lets you rotate it freely across the screen. And I accidentally swapped my screens there. There we go. But so now I can control the on-screen pointer with my right analog stick. Now to right, you just hold down the right trigger and move your thumbstick. Yeah, it's hard, whatever. But that is how you get working controls for the touchscreen within DeSmuMe. But as you can see, DeSmuMe works really well on Xbox Series X and S as well. But from here, let's go ahead and talk about some of the core options available to us within DeSmuMe. So again, going down to our core options, our first tab is going to be System. And the first option we can select within it is our firmware language, so you can manually set this to any of the supported languages. Next, if you want to use those BIOS files that we placed earlier, you can turn them on. And if you want to be able to boot into the DS home screen, you can also enable that option here as well, but do be aware that this requires DeSmuMe to be running in interpreter mode, which it is doing by default. Interpreter is slower than using the JIT, but this is the only way to get the actual DS menu on DeSmuMe. And these options do require a content restart, so I'm just going to go ahead and do so now real quick. And there we go, my DS home screen has booted up. And we could use it just like on an original DS, and it's pulling all the information for my colors and nickname from the firmware file. So everything's working as intended. Very cool. Our next option is to load our DS games into system memory, so this prevents any potential issue stemming from the Xbox USB drive slowing down load times or stutters from loading or whatever. Shouldn't really happen, but in those rare cases that it might, you can enable this. Now our next option is to choose the amount of CPU cores we're going to be running with our Xbox emulation, so you could crank this up to 4 to just give the best potential processing to the emulator to reduce any potential slowdown you might get from more demanding games. It might come at the slight trade-off of some added input latency. It's not something I personally notice, but for those of you that can tell a frame or two difference, do be aware it might cause that. But next up, CPU mode. This is where you can change it from interpreter over to JIT. And again, this will give you a better speed boost, but it comes at the cost of losing out on being able to boot into the DS menu. So preference on which one you want to use. Try out your games. If you're not getting performance issues in interpreter, you can just stay with it and still have access to that DS menu. And if you do switch over to the JIT, you can change the JIT block size here. It's set to 12 by default, but a good balance would be going to set it to that 32, but you can just leave it on 12. It's a very game-specific setting. And last up, enabled advanced bus level timing, just leave that one on. Alright, graphics tab. Frame skip it, bleh. Now our next option is to change the internal resolution that our Nintendo DS games are running at, so even in software mode, DeSmuMe can upscale games, which is an advantage over Melon DS only being able to do so in hardware mode. But it is a very, very demanding thing to do, so you're not going to be able to push this very far before you start experiencing lag in your titles. So for my example today on my Series S, I have Mario Kart DS, and I'm going to up this to a 4x resolution scale. And it is causing massive performance problems. So we have to be more conservative with this. So let's go ahead and knock this down to 3 and see what happens. Alright, so for Mario Kart DS, 3x up-resing is working as it is supposed to, but it is a very weird scaling, so my integer scale is making the screen pretty small, so messing around with screen layouts would definitely improve this. But there we go, so Mario Kart DS 3x up-resing is its limit. Next up, OpenGL Rasterizer. We can't use that on Xbox Series X and S because the Xbox does not support OpenGL backends by default, and this is not an angle version of the core. So this does not work. But next up, soft 3D high-res color interpolation, so you can enable this to get better high-res color interpolation. Personal preference if you like it or not. Recommend leaving the line hack on, and then texture hack is another personal preference one depending on the game. Leave edge marking on, and then finally texture scaling XBRZ. So this is good for your 2D assets. You can then scale those textures with XBRZ, but do be aware this is also very demanding on processing power. So even with a 2x XBRZ texture enhancement on Mario Kart DS at a 3x scale, that is too laggy. So it's going to be a real trade-off between internal resolution and texture up-resing, so do be aware of that. And finally, texture deposterization. This is another one of those personal preference on if you like the way it looks or not. Anyway, backing out, next up, screen. So here we go, the screen layout. So we have top bottom, which is your typical Nintendo DS layout. Then you got bottom top, which just flips them, and then left right. So this will make your screens bigger and side by side to better fit your 16:9 screen. And then you can also set it to right left. You can do top screen only, bottom screen only, and then my favorite is the hybrid top and bottom. So with this option, you get a much bigger main screen while still getting the original interpretation of the dual screen layout on the right of the display. Next, you can set a screen gap if you're using one of the top bottom modes. If I recall correctly, the 90 is the original DS screen gap. But regardless, it's personal preference on whether you like the gap or not. It doesn't show up right on the hybrid screen layout, so whatever. But now we have a couple of specific hybrid screen layout stuff. So the ratio right now is set to 3:1, so the big screen is 3 times bigger than the small screen. If you'd like to have them more similar proportion, you can set it to 2:1, but 3:1 looks really good. And next up, hybrid layout scale, so small screen is 1:1 pixels. Personal preference if you want that on or not. With integer scaling, it kind of does that already. And then hybrid layout, you can have it show both screens, which is on by default, or you can have it only show the bottom screen. I personally like having both, but personal preference. And then hybrid layout, cursor always on small screen, so if your small screen is your touch screen, you can keep it locked to that. But again, you can swap screens with the right analog stick click. So you can disable this option, so you can still use the analog stick on this screen as well. But anyway, moving on, input, mouse/pointer, leave this on. Pointer type, leave this on mouse. You can ignore the mouse speed and pointer rotation. And then we have the pointer modes for left and right analog stick, which we already covered. And then you can set the dead zone for your analog stick as you're using it as a DS mouse cursor, and also set an acceleration if you need to. I don't really need to, it's not that big. Then you can set the emulated stylus pressure modifier %, this is fine at 50, and then you can change the pointer color between the available ones here. Alright, backing out. Our last option, microphone button noise type. This is set to pattern. You can also set it to random. So again, if you need to use the microphone for any games, head into port 1 controls and you can set which button that is set to. So right now it is set to the left thumbstick click in. But with that, we've covered all of the core options available within DeSmuMe. So as always, if there's options you want to have set for some games but not others, you can go up to manage core options and save them as a game options file, so that way they only apply to that single game and not the core as a whole. Now the last thing I want to cover in this video in particular is the use of shaders. So going into our shaders tab, you can enable them here. And if you've downloaded them as shown in my initial setup video, you can go into load, shader slang, and in the handheld section down here, you can load up whatever you want, but in the handheld section there is a really nice Nintendo DS LCD grid. And by applying this, it gives you the proper motion blur that is present on Nintendo DS handheld screens, as well as the washed out colors. And then a really nice grid line effect. So it's very authentic. I really like the way it looks, but it does wash the colors out quite considerably, so not everyone's gonna like this, and I understand that. But that's the great thing about shaders. There are just so freaking many of them, so you can apply all kinds of other ones. If you want the less saturated colors but not the motion blur, you could do that. You could do just normal LCD grids. Like, you don't have to do any one specific thing. That's what's so great about it. But once you find a shader that you really like, just come back into the shaders tab, click on the save button, and then you can save them as a core or game preset, so you can have multiple shaders for different types of content. But with that, we have now covered Nintendo DS emulation on the Xbox Series X and S version of Retroarch. Again, using both of the available cores is the best way to get the best DS experience possible right now, just because Melon DS technically is a bit more accurate and is better at handling the 2D stuff, whereas DeSmuMe will give you the upscaling for the 3D stuff, which a lot of you definitely prefer. But as always, thank you for watching today's video. I hope it helps you get your Nintendo DS emulation projects up and running to your desires on the Xbox Series X and S. But here at the end, do have a couple of big favors to ask. If you haven't done so already, please be sure to hit that like, dislike, depending on how much you like today's tutorial, as well as that sub button and notification bell so you can see when new videos go live on the channel. Loads of content always coming your way, and I'd love to have each and every one of you along for the ride. For anyone interested in further helping support the channel and keep it going, be sure to check out that join button here on YouTube, or that Patreon link in the bottom right hand corner of the screen. Little goes a long way to keeping us going, and we just appreciate all of our current champions so very much. But until next time, my wonderful internet peeps, you all stay awesome, keep on gaming, and we will see you back next video.